Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Morneau. A new report shows that many G20 countries across the globe barely made or missed renewable energy goals. Our guest today is joining us from Paris to share more about the report. Rana Adib is Executive Director of REN21, an organization that brings together a network of science professionals, governments, NGOs, and industry to work towards the transition to renewable energy. Rana, I want to thank you so much for joining us and staying up late. You're joining us from Paris.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, Anthony.
Let's start off with the report. This is kind of some shocking news for some folks who may be thinking that we're moving towards a positive area when it comes to renewable energy. Your report found that fossil fuel use in global energy has pretty much stayed the same over the past decade. What can you tell us about this?
Yes, indeed. I think this is indeed a shocking news. I guess that's the right expression. The reality is that we have been looking very much, in particular as a renewable community, at the development of renewable energy. And this has been very positive. We are looking here over 10 years about a share increase of, let's say, 8.7% to 11%. Now, the reality is actually when you're looking into the overall energy system, as you mentioned it's shocking because the share of fossil fuel has been stagnating over the last 10 years. So this means that today we're basically consuming more fossil fuel than ever, because the energy demand has grown. And this clearly points to the fact that a structural change is fundamentally needed. So it's not enough to support renewable energy. We need to end fossil fuel and phase out existing capacities.
Okay, so what does your report find was some of the main causes why there really hasn't been much of a change?
So the reality is indeed that in particular when we're looking into the energy system, fossil fuel and the economy has been centered around fossil fuel. And this leads to the fact that there is still very present fossil fuel subsidies existing in more than 110 countries. $500 billion per year are going into fossil fuel subsidies. And I compare this with $303 billion going into renewable power and fuels in 2020. So you already see basically this disconnect. Another aspect is also that there is basically no price on pollution linked to fossil fuel. And the result of this is, even though renewable energy today is the least cost option, it is not competing in a level playing field. The other aspect is also that the economy and power dynamics are still very close to government decisions. And in particular, sectors like heating and cooling and transportation that highly depend on fossil fuel have basically encountered much pushback on moving to renewable energy.
So what's the holdup? Why is it not making economic sense for governments to really invest in this right now?
The reality is it does make economic sense. Today, solar photovoltaics and wind is really the least cost option, and the 2020 findings have shown that renewable power competes with existing coal power in many areas of the world. So ultimately, it does not come down to an economic decision, but to a political will decision, and also to the fact that, as I said, there is power in place. Today, it is very clear, considering the climate change, the necessity to build a resilient energy infrastructure. And I think you just recently had like the challenging situation in Texas where natural gas capacities, there was an outage on those. So it is very clear that climate change does have an impact, and we need to move to resilient, efficient, renewable-based energy infrastructure. Now, this means that governments very clearly also need not to only share a vision, but have the strategies to move there.
Now, there's probably some people who are watching this program who don't believe in climate change who may feel that this is just the natural order of things. What do you have to say to folks who feel that way, and what data can you point to address that climate change is real?
Mm-hmm. So the reality is, and we clearly see it, so the environment is heating up, that's the first thing. Sea level is rising, and we really have natural hazards that very clearly have an impact on cities, on countries, and very often also the developing countries in the world. But in the US, I mean, there has been many impacts, I think, locally, also creating not only environmental and social impacts, but major costs. Now, regardless of those, what I would tell those people is, even if you do not believe in climate change, renewable energy makes economic sense. And for instance, we can clearly see it when you're looking into the renewable power generation over the capacities in 2020. There has been a growth rate of 10% over 2019. When we're looking into corporate power purchase agreement and the capacities built by private sector, here we have a growth of 18%. And this is only because it does not make only environmental sense, but economic sense. And companies are looking into energy security too, in a better management of their energy cost and into least cost options. So this is clearly an argument.
Let's dive into that a little bit more. Your report talks about this renewables making clear business sense. Could you give me more data and information about how that may make sense for folks? Because there's a lot of policymakers who may be watching this program, and you mentioned that this obviously makes economic sense, but politically it's not making sense for some folks right now. What's it going to take to make those policymakers believe what you're saying and invest in renewable energy and make it easier for folks to invest in renewable energy?
I think it's where basically the market push is going there. And when you're looking into, and I think the last weeks have really had major announcements here, the International Energy Agency, which is one of the more conservative players in the field, has clearly sent out the net zero scenario and is calling for a shift from fossil fuel to renewable energy. And actually also clearly stating that there is no need for additional fossil fuel capacities. So I think this is one aspect. When we're looking into recent court decisions, shareholder influence basically on cases like Shell, Exxon, and Chevron, it clearly shows that today for corporations, it is important to move there because the market is asking for it. Shareholders are asking for it. And we also see that it's about a matter of access to finance. And I guess if climate change and the scientific evidence here is not convincing, the market and the citizens' voices and the corporations, the private sector voices and finance voices clearly have a high influence on policymakers.
I'm talking with you from New Mexico, a state that heavily relies on the oil and gas industry for its state budget. Mm-hmm. Now, this isn't, a unique story. There are some states in the United States that do this as well. And I'd like to hear from you. What do you have to say to policymakers who are concerned about the oil and gas industry and the future of it? You mentioned that renewable energy makes sense. How can renewable energy make sense for a state like New Mexico? But also, how can it help with the state budget? Because so much is relying on the fossil fuel industry in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is you're touching on a very important point, and I think this is where it's also clear that we are entering a new era. We're not an era anymore where it is about showing that renewable energy is technologically feasible. It's really about making a shift of an economic system, and this clearly also means that the oil and gas players and oil and gas consumers need to be part of this shift. The real advantage here is, I think that especially the oil and gas sectors clearly have skill sets which are very important, and there are opportunities basically. A part of the fact that it's about addressing finance and accessing finance. When we are looking into offshore wind, When we're looking into geothermal in particular, the oil and gas sector can clearly invest in these sectors, but also apply the skill sets they have developed over many, many years. So there is opportunities for value creation, economic value creation, about local jobs, and about building basically least cost and resilient electricity and energy infrastructure. So I think that's clearly one aspect. The other one is also, and I think when we're looking into the oil and gas activities, or the move about offshore wind and geothermal, I'm focusing on those two because they're highly relevant for the oil and gas sector. Very clearly, we see that the whole supply chain can create basically jobs. And I think this was if I recall correctly, it was in Texas that there was a first company that has built basically a vessel to allow for the development of offshore wind. And this clearly shows that I think it was a couple of million going basically into the development of this, but it's also jobs linked to it and the possibility to develop new industrial activities that lie in the future and will not end up in stranded assets.
Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the report's findings with G20 countries and their renewable energy goals. It was kind of surprising to learn, according to this report, that many of the G20 countries didn't even have renewable energy goals, and the ones that did struggled to get there. What were your findings with this and some of the key causes?
So I think what is really important to see is that 2020 has been disruptive, but it has also set a new norm in terms of ambition. So there have never been as many net zero energy or emission targets as in 2020, whether we're looking at national governments, subnational governments, cities, and corporations. So I think this is very clearly where we have a new norm to take into account. Now, when we're really looking into how did this new norm in net zero really translate into concrete renewable energy policies, unfortunately, there is a major disconnect on the policy side. And as you mentioned, from the G20 countries, only 5 countries have a renewable energy target economy-wide. Only 3 of them are reaching it. When we're also looking to the renewable energy targets, we do see that many countries have basically renewable energy targets, didn't reach them, and did also, when they were phased out, basically not renew them. So there is a real problem in terms of building a continuous policy and regulatory framework and sending very strong messages to the industry, to investors, and to citizens. What are the reasons for it? I think there are plenty of reasons for it. When we're looking to the power sector, indeed, today least cost is clearly a key argument. And we see that in many countries, basically the private sector is even pushing governments to be more ambitious and create the right market frameworks. When we're looking, however, into heating and cooling and transport in particular, we see that since 2017, the renewable energy targets and the policies have been stagnating and even went down. Where does this come from? It definitely comes from the fact that when we're looking to these sectors, they highly depend on fossil fuel, and the renewable energy economic benefits in comparison are not able to compete because there is still subsidies existing. This is one aspect. The other one is, however, also that decision makers here are much more decentralized. It's often not the national governments. When we're speaking about the building sector, it can be cities, road transportation, and we really need to bring basically the players from other economic sectors to the table and discuss the energy transition. And this is clearly why we're calling for making renewable energy a key performance indicator in any economic activity, because energy is everywhere, and we need to make sure that every decision is really putting the renewable energy into the center of the attention.
Okay, so what players need to be in the conversation when it comes to investing more in renewable energy?
Very clearly, I mean, the industrial sector, and I think there is, we clearly see it with renewable-based hydrogen developments, etc. Even the steel sector and heavy industry is now looking into renewable energy. So this is one part. When we're looking into heating and cooling, there is the other part, which is the building sector. And this means many different players. It's the cities, it's real estate, but it's also the owners and the renters. It already showed the diversity of players. Urban planners need to be part of it, architects need to be part of it, and the discussion is much more heterogeneous, I guess, than deciding that we're moving energy supply from one fuel to another. When we're looking into transport, again, we clearly see, and this is where there are major opportunities. Electric mobility is pushing for an opportunity to develop renewable energy also in the transport sector. And players here, again, will be cities, it will be public transportation fleets, it will be private fleet owners. And I take the example of IKEA, for instance, which is global. We clearly see they have, as a corporation, they have basically their targets to move to 100% renewable electricity, if I recall correctly, by 2025. But today they completely acknowledge the fact that it's not only about electricity, it needs to go through all energy consumption, but they also go down the whole supply chain and accompany the suppliers to have access to renewable energy and renewable energy investment. So there is really another way and a much more holistic approach to this change and structural shift that needs to occur.
Do you think with a conversation around renewable energy and energy in general, we tend to focus more on fossil fuels or renewable energy industry like solar or wind instead of what you just described, which is buildings and different industry, transportation, things that we need to really grasp when we talk about energy? It connects so much of our world. Do you think we need to think of it in more of that term, like how it connects all of us?
Yes, I think the reality is really that energy is everywhere, and energy is driving not only social or societal activities, but economic activities. And as a result, we are all, at least as an energy consumer, and any of us listening here is an energy consumer, so we are an actor basically of our choices. That's the first thing. And interestingly, I think when you're really looking before the fossil fuel era, renewable energy or energy was a very local and decentralized topic. It has been centralized with the fossil fuel development. So this has led to other market structures, institutional structures, industry, etc. And renewable energy has the advantage or the characteristics, I guess, that it can be centralized, but it can also be decentralized. And this means that the variety of market players and system players, decision makers, it's much, much bigger. So as you mentioned, I think it's really about bridging the part of providing energy, but also consuming energy. But it's also about investing into energy, because the reality is, and we clearly see that there is today a need to develop societal support for renewables also. And this also means that anybody can benefit economically of having wind turbine basically around the corner.
I'd like to talk with you about pandemic relief. Now, according to your report, much of the pandemic relief, well, more went to the fossil fuel industry than the renewable energy. Your report said 6 times the fossil fuel industry got 6 times more money than the renewable energy industry. Why did this happen? What are your thoughts on that? And how does this impact goals for renewable energy that countries across the world, some have put into place?
So the reality here is, and I would say like this is for me clearly, I mean, one of the mind-blowing results of this report, and profoundly shocking, because it's very clear that there has been a focus, basically short-term pressure, but also short-term interest of few have clearly undermined global societal, environmental, long-term targets and goals. And we see that the policymakers do align on those. I think this is, again, 2020 has peaked in terms of net zero ambition. Now, as you mentioned, indeed, the economic recovery packages would have been a key opportunity to drive the change, the structural change that is required. And the reality is that the US dollar can only be spent once. So for the government, there is an opportunity here to invest into not invest in stranded assets, because the reality is climate change will have an impact on natural gas and oil and gas infrastructure. So it will be stranded assets. This is just, and that's also why the finance sector is divesting from fossil fuel investments. And unfortunately, governments have very clearly not taken this opportunity, not taking the opportunity that the energy demand has gone down, and have basically not shown the leadership and the courage to make this change happen, but rather followed existing and established industry. And I think when we're looking into, and I'm looking at the numbers here, but when you're looking into the pandemic in the US, I mean, I think the oil and gas sector, it's again mind-blowing. 70 US oil and gas companies have received $8.2 billion US from the economic recovery packages. 15 laws have also allowed for 72 billion unconditional fossil fuel support. At the same time, 60,000 people have been laid off in oil and gas in the US. Wow. And oil and gas companies have reported, major oil and gas companies have reported major gains beginning of 2021. So I think there is really a question of who do these decisions serve?
I see. So let's focus on the U.S. a little bit more. What were some of the other key findings in the United States that you found with this report?
So I think what is really interesting about the US is that basically the US has been a key market when we're looking into wind and solar photovoltaics. And since you also asked about Texas and New Mexico, basically, I think what is a very important message is that if Texas was, for instance, national government, they would rank at the 5th place as a renewable energy in terms of renewable energy power capacities. And I think this already shows that it makes business sense. I think there is also the case, for instance, of, and I'm really sorry, let me find the Vistra Corp, which has, I think, over 35 natural gas plants, and where there has been the decision of a corporation not to invest in natural gas anymore, but invest into solar photovoltaics and storage. The reality is there is a market, there are business opportunities, there are opportunities for job creation, and there are opportunities for a sector that had the peak times, I guess, in the past to reinvent itself and really be part of the economy of tomorrow.
Looking at other countries around the world, what are some success stories that you can point to where this country met their goal? Here's some of the challenges they overcame during this last decade, and here's some of the reasons why they were able to do it.
So one country obviously is, like, when we're looking at the leading countries, is China and the US have been the leaders, and China has been very, very active on the solar PV side, on the wind side, on bringing costs down, but also on really acknowledging the fact that when we're speaking about the shift, it's not only about the energy production capacities, but it's also about the infrastructure and building the infrastructure. So building grids, building interconnection and reinforcing it. And that is clearly one of the countries where we can see that there is an understanding that it's not about switching the fuel, but it's really about developing new energy systems. I'll take the other example, for instance, when we're looking into Spain, which is a leading country in terms of really driving the transition, not only towards renewable energy, but also phasing out fossil fuel. There has been an announcement in May, I think this year, that Spain is banning any fossil fuel by 2025, if I'm correct. And they are working very clearly, plant by plant, with any company and power generation or natural gas installation to make sure that these are being phased out. The reality is there is a clear acknowledgement of the fact that any investment going into oil and gas and natural oil and gas is a stranded asset and will cost the economy. So they're really putting a lot of effort in negotiating this exit. Other examples, I'll take the example of Costa Rica. Obviously, so Costa Rica has high hydroelectricity, so hydropower. They have developed also solar photovoltaics and wind, and have moved to 100% electricity, with the result that there is an excess of electricity. A similar situation occurs today in Uruguay, for instance. They've clearly used this as an opportunity to also push for the transition in other sectors by developing electric mobility in the transport sector and really making it a national identity topic and saying like it's about the sovereignty. And I think these are really interesting examples because they also show that driving the transition, it's not only a political decision, it's not only an economic decision, but it is about accompanying the different decision makers to really support this shift and understand the benefits of it. And I think this is basically where we need to develop new discourses.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Rana Adib is Executive Director of REN21. The organization has released the 2021 Renewables Global Status Report. I want to thank you so much for joining us for the program to discuss this report.
Thank you very much.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno.